Hi, today I have a big pleasure and honor to speak with composer from Berlin, Rama Gottfried, about his piece. Hi, Rama.
Hi, good morning.
So today we will speak about your piece, Animism. Can you just give us like short introduction to the piece, right?
Yeah, sure. Um, Sometimes it's hard to give a short introduction because I'm so uh, deep into it. But yes, so Animism is a piece that's developed out of a ongoing a sequence of pieces, but also an ongoing desire to engage with and to develop a kind of scenographic composition. Um, and the first pieces I working in this way have been like a apopheny and um, scenes from the plastosphere. And animism is kind of a sequel to these. I think of them as kind of almost having some similar characters that develop through them. Um, and animism is a larger scale version of this scenario. And so, to explain a little bit more detail, I've been working with live cinema, using different kinds of objects, very organic material, semi representational, but also strongly abstract and kind of symbolic visual language that's also very textural. And so the way that as a composer, I'm very often thinking about texture and gesture and the way sound feels as a kind of tactile sensation. Um, and so when working with these video pieces, I'm developing kind of a puppetry, object theater kind of instruments that or entities that the performers are interacting with that both are visually interesting and also create sound. And so in these first two versions, Apopheny is the first piece, which was written in 2016, sort of developed in 2015. Um, the title Apopheny is this sort of principle of finding patterns in abstract situations or seemingly random content. So, like looking at the clouds and seeing shapes in the clouds, or um, can also be a kind of neurosis of my vocabulary is blanking right now. When you are, what is the word? Like paranoia of thinking that things are connected, but maybe when maybe they're not really. So, but this is also a kind of process that is part of making sense of things, and I think is actually a really important thing that we do when we are, reading text. We're making connections between things, um, and so in apopheny, one of the ideas that I was working with was to use very hard to control physical materials like crumpled up pieces of paper, and or like piles of glitter and feathers, where if you just barely touch it, it creates a whole sequence of actions. And in a way, this is also coming out of instrumental technique of setting up like a prepared piano or complex instrumental techniques. Sometimes are very organic, and one little gesture has an immense effect. Um, and for years, I've been working with highly amplified instrumental techniques. So this is also very much coming out of this approach. And so, working with these very organic materials, both visually and sound wise, the idea of apopheny is that the performers have to engage in this action of finding sense, making sense of something that is abstract, making sense of something that is dense and so in the performance they have to do that in front of the audience. They're sitting there, they're confronted with this complex situation, and there is a kind of dramaturgy that's in place, and there's a structure in the piece that defines how different sections fit together, and these sort of and a mapping of the video analysis to the sound. I kind of skipped over some of the technical things, but so the scenario of the apophany is kind of also based on as my family has a company for software for neuroscience, and so I've spent a lot of time working with microscopes. And like when I was a teenager, I had a job where I would calibrate video cameras with motorized microscope stages. And so in a way, these pieces are kind of using that same kind of situation of where you have a very close magnified video image, and then the action is taking place in this kind of microscopic or miniature world. And so what I'm doing in apophany and scenes from the plastosphere is using computer vision algorithms to analyze the shapes and the movement of these objects and use that data to control sound. And so I think of it as kind of making the voices of the characters with the sound, or at the same time also the environment. So how does when a character moves, how does the environment react? How of course it's like a multimodal situation. So in getting back to this idea of apophany, the performers are confronted with this complex scene that they have to manipulate and perform through to find these characters in the material. And so I'm very interested in this kind of empathetic action that the performers have to go outside of themselves and try to understand something else besides themselves and to engage with it. And so Scenes from the Plastosphere is also leading out of that, starting to think more in ecological scenarios, still using, there's actually already ecological concerns in apophany as well. And then in animism, I think this is also very related, the whole idea of, or my interpretation of animism as a kind of worldview is also related to this apophany idea, in that animism, or there's some like panpsychism or these other kinds of philosophies of where we can recognize that there is a kind of life in objects, or life in general, that things are alive, things have a sort of essence to them, and so in animism, much of the computer vision algorithm has been taken over by the ensemble, and that's sort of the experimental thing that I'm doing in the piece, is that I'm setting up situations where the ensemble has to read the screen. They have material, just like the computer has material, and the performers have in apophany there was a score. In Scenes from the Plastosphere, it's actually a script more, so it's more of a theatrical score. In animism, it's kind of combining these two ideas, which is that the performers have clearly defined musical textural articulations and sounds and gestures that are composed, but the micro details and the rhythmic placement within certain time blocks are left open, so that they can adjust what they're doing and synchronize with the image on the screen. And so the idea is that the ensemble as a collective, as a whole, can become part of this scene. So maybe each instrument aligns with a different aspect of this environment that the video images are working in. And again, it has, I hope that somehow it's not, you know, it's not like activist music, but it's kind of it's something I'm very, I feel attuned to somehow. And I think that the process of performing these pieces have a kind of psychological resonance, both with performers and, you know, I often write as an audience member, as a future audience member, as what I would like to see or experience.
And can you tell me who commissions the piece, right?
Animism was commissioned by the Rainy Days Festival. Lydia Rilling was originally commissioned for the 2020 Rainy Days, but due to lockdown and, well, there was the lockdown in the spring, and then it seemed like things were going to happen, and then there was the second, I don't know if that was the second wave or whatever wave that was in the fall of 2020. Things were shut down again.
Yes, yes.
And so the piece was postponed by a year. Yeah, that was difficult.
Did you choose ensemble or ensemble choose you?
Say again?
Did you choose ensemble or ensemble chose you?
That's a good question. Actually, I'm not sure. I think, I don't know if Lydia, I don't know exactly how it came to be. I've worked with Ensemble Mosaic quite a lot in the past, so I have a great relationship with them, and I'm old friends with the Adapter group from before I did my PhD in UC Berkeley. I studied at the UDK in Berlin, and so I knew them from before. And so it could be, I don't know how it happened. That's the mystery of.
And how you choose the title of the piece?
Well, I've been. I think that what I chose the title because, you know, having worked on these earlier pieces where I've started thinking about what is the action that's happening in apopheny. What is it about working with scenography and puppetry that's interesting to me? And I started reading some books on animal studies. There's an interesting book called Animal Cosmopolitics, I think it's called. It's a collection of writings, and it's people like Isabel Stenglers, Donna Haraway, Timothy Morton, and so Isabel Stenglers has an article where she talks about reclaiming animism in some of these, in this sort of perspective. And somehow I realized, when I read that, I realized that a lot of the things that I had been thinking about connected to this idea.
Yes, yes.
And so I started thinking that maybe for this piece, because it was a large ensemble, I felt like, well, maybe I'll just, I feel like I'm still working. Every time I'm writing a new piece, I'm like reevaluating everything in my everything. Like, why am I writing this piece? What am I, and it's funny, every time, and it's a really difficult process to constantly be re-questioning everything you're doing. But I feel like doing that has helped to refine, and animism, I think, is another refinement of of trying to figure out what is it that, what kind of art do I really want to make, and
what kind of art do you really want to make?
I don't know. I have to think about it more. I think that I'm really interested in physicality, really, about sort of material and acoustics,
Yes.
and space and sound, and I'm interested in. I think I'm finally starting to make the art that I really want to make, finally, which is using space as part of the composition. So at the end of Animism, I don't know if I should give it away for people who haven't seen it yet, but at the end of the piece, so spoiler alert, at the end of the piece there's like long strips of paper come out which expand the spatial experience of the piece strongly. In Scenes from the Plastosphere, I did something similar using a disco ball.
Yes.
So for most of the piece, there's this focus on the very frontal viewing of the screen. But then at the end, it transforms. It reflects outwards, and of course, we all know the feeling of being in a disco ball room.
Yes.
That you can feel the walls, you can feel the space so much more.
And right, as I understand, this is one thing of sensorial experience, right? And the second is this video puppetry, right? It's the screen, right? So you can see. What kind of other elements you have used, let's say, to build this sensorial experience?
Well, I mean, I don't know, all sorts of stuff. I've done pieces with like motorized music boxes. Actually, that was the first piece I ever did with really long strips of paper. In 2010, I did an installation here in Berlin, in Stadtbad Wedding. It was an old Olympic swimming pool. So using motors, I did a lot of work with spatial audio. So at IRCAM, worked with wavefield synthesis, higher order ambisonics. What else? Recently used a motion capture system for a piece that's, I don't have really good documentation for it yet, but a piece called Corporis Fabrica,
Yes.
which is I forget how big, it's like maybe 4 by 4 meters of fabric.
Yes.
Covered with small infrared reflectors, and there's 2 performers that are underneath the fabric, kind of
Yes.
doing different kinds of movements, and then analyzing that with motion capture system and producing sound from that. What else? But yeah, I mean, sky's the limit, really. I'm open for it,
Yes.
anything.
And how you came to the idea to with the paper in Animism?
For the origami structure?
Yes.
How did we come up with that idea? Well, that was created in collaboration with my friend Iratsuki Hideaki, who I've done 2 other installation pieces with. Actually, we met at the Stadtbad Wedding when I did that motorized music box piece. He had also a motorized piece in the next atelier, or it was a group show, the next gallery space. And so then we did a piece together called Cloud Machines, which was a set of motorized sculptures that hung in the air that had that would change shape over time. And so I composed a piece controlling the movement of the motors, and also had transducers inside the objects. And so when I was working on animism, I knew I wanted to have a three-dimensional transforming from the two-dimensional space to three-dimensional
Yes.
movement. And so I worked with Iratsuki to develop the origami structure. He made a bunch of different prototypes and worked out trying to find different types of movement that we could make.
Yes. And what is the central message of the piece, right?
That's a tough question. I always hesitate whether to tell other people what to think about it, you know. Well, I mean, also, you know, messages and pieces, I feel like I'm a little skeptical sometimes of if you tell someone what the message of something is, that it will have, I feel like it lessens the impact of the actual message in some ways.
Yes. Yes.
Because the message is a kind of experience and is a kind of action that has to take place when you experience the piece. And I think the message, I mean, sensory, like Marshall McLuhan stuff, but like the piece itself could be the message, but of course, you know, it does have a title, Animism, right? So I'm invoking a huge amount of philosophical and anthropological history. So yeah, I mean, I think the piece is about, like I was talking about before, this kind of work that we do to understand other things, other types of life, other kinds of people, even
Yes.
other kinds of situations, and I think that this is really important to the future of the human species, that if we're going to find some kind of harmony in the world, we have to try to understand not only other people from other cultures and other places, but other types of creatures, other, you know, that's this animal, this cosmopolitan, I think it's called Cosmopolitan Animals, maybe, where it talks about that a real cosmopolitan perspective, you know, a cosmopolitan place is a place where people are coming from all different other backgrounds and coming together and living in a city, right? But that should also include other animals and other types of life, and even thinking that more broadly, that when we're designing cities, architecture, things like that, that we should be also considering how other types of life will interact with these structures, and how we can create space for them as well.
Got it. Got it. And can you just tell about a bit about set, right? So I understand it began something
I'm sorry,
about
say
set, right? About instrument.
the setup.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. So the instruments and which part, the whole setup, or
Yes. Yes.
which the whole thing? Okay, so it's, yeah. So so I'm using this kind of transparent screen, semi like a gauze. It's called tulle, or what's it called? Voile. Voile is the name of the fabric, and so there's this semi-transparent screen that sits at the very front of the stage, and the ensemble is behind.
Yes. And it's full ensemble, right? To understand.
It's full ensemble. It's so it's ensemble adapter, apparat, brass quintet, sonar string quartet, and ensemble mosaic all playing together. So it's like a large ensemble. There's no bass and no bassoon, but there's everything else. And so everyone is close mic'd, this like super amplified and playing very quietly. And then in the middle front of the stage is the video puppetry setup. And so there's a small, it's almost like a small movie set. I'm using a camera slider, which on the miniature scale becomes like a huge tracking system where you can pan across the landscape. And there's a set of lights, and the materials of the puppetry are things like, everything is, I've just brought everything back, it's all in boxes now, but yeah, things, it's a lot of plants in this piece. Plants. So it's mostly plants and bioplastic. That's another big part of this. Is that was one of the things I researched during the lockdown, was how to make bioplastic. And so I started making different types of characters with bioplastic. So there's one part where there's this kind of heart beating, which is made out of a agar-agar based bioplastic with red onion skin pigment. And so it looks just like, looks like a human, or it looks like an organ tissue. But yeah, so it's agar-agar, and then there's another kind of slug-like creature in the first scene that's made out of cornstarch and vinegar and what's the other, glycerin, vegetable glycerin. So there's bioplastic, in the materials are bioplastic, metal, wire, paper, and various different types of plants, and water, thread. I think everything is constructed out of those materials, some wood.
And what was the process of composing, right? How you started and what series?
Right. So I started with developing these different scenes that would happen throughout the piece. Actually, it's hard to remember how I actually started. This was a long time ago now, but I developed. I had some ideas already coming from scenes from the plastosphere that I knew that I wanted to continue developing. For instance, in scenes from the plastosphere, there were two different versions of the piece. The first one was just 3 scenes, and then for Rainy Days, I forget, it was 2019 maybe, or 18. I composed a fourth scene for Scenes for the Plastosphere, which used a plant as one of the main aspects. And I realized that the plants have just such a rich dynamic to them. I mean, visually, they're so detailed, right? Because it's organic material, and so you can keep going closer and closer into it, and it keeps getting more and more detailed. And so I found that it worked really well with the video footage, like this, the video scenario. And so I knew I wanted to continue working in that way. And then, so what I've done also in purely instrumental works in a kind of similar way, I figure out what a kind of the palette will be for the piece. So I know that I'm going to have these different types of musical material, and I'm thinking about the visual aspects in very much the same way. So it has a lot to do with texture and with gesture and the kind of physicality. So certain types of sounds and certain types of materials move in certain ways. So if I know, for instance, that I'm going to work with the this slug material. I know that the part of the action is kind of stuck to the ground because it's has this weight, but it also has these antennas which are like moving around. So there's this lightness to the antennas and this sort of weight to the body. And so based on that information and that feeling of the material, I can then start to know how that material will relate to or contrast with other types of material. And so then I figured out a kind of overall form to the piece, and so each scene has a kind of different types of material that are happening musically and visually. And so then once I knew what the material would be, I could then work with these, figure out what go in more and more detail. So I first, I can't remember if I think sort of push one thing forward and then the other. So I figure out some visual aspects, then I figure out what the sound element would be, then I figure out some more visual aspects, and figure out more sound. And then at some point I think spend more time on each element. So then I spend a longer time figuring out what the dramaturgy of these characters will be, how the interactions will develop over time. And then once that was figured out, I could switch back to the composition part, and I knew in my head what the types of actions would be. So then it was much easier to develop the musical material.
Yes. And can you just a little bit describe your dramaturgical ideas of the piece?
Yes. Well, I mean, the crucial moment is when the screen falls down and there's the three-dimensional character comes out. But there's also these other elements in the piece of there's a kind of DNA aspect of these threads that are underlying everything. And a lot of it is kind of sort of symbolic in that way. So there's the antennas relate to the string. And the string, there's a sequence. Here I am giving away all of the secrets of the interpretation, but so there's I guess in my mind I was thinking about the strings as being this kind of like DNA action. And so there's a sequence that happens where we go from the DNA, which is on a smooth white background, almost like a laboratory setting, and the camera pans down and the paper transforms into geometric folded structures, which is kind of like a solidification of this sort of DNA principles taking form. And then we continue panning and we start seeing bioplastic skin. So it's another level of, I'm not saying that I believe in a sort of hierarchy or progression to evolution or anything like that, but that just exploring these things. And so we go from DNA to structure to organic structure to this kind of string character that then starts moving. So then we have this sort of action, the puppetry, which is also made out of string. And so that's kind of in a way, a kind of life-giving action, or a life recognized, or I don't know what the right terminology is. That is a snapshot of a life scenario. And I think that the piece is kind of, that's the sort of underlying dramaturgical action that's happening throughout the piece in different ways. And we have different settings as well. So there's and scales. So we go from a very close-up scale in the first scene of being really we jump right into a very complex life situation. And then we kind of take a step back into a more laboratory setting where things are reduced and we look at small details. And then there's this whole, there's the part with the heart beating. And so it's like, in a way, it's also could be in some ways like some of the pieces like being inside a body, or seeing environments as being an entity, like the sort of one organism idea of the earth being like an organism in itself, that we are all kind of part of it. I love this fact that there are, I was reading, they used to say it was 10-to-1 non-human cells to human cells in our bodies, but it's actually, depends, it shifts, but it's at least 1-to-1. So at least half of the cell mass in our bodies is technically non-human cells. And so we are already, in our bodies, we are already a collection of entities. We don't, it doesn't, somehow we have a unified perception, but actually we're already made of these different things. I read interestingly recently that there's a theory that birds, the two hemispheres of the bird's brain are disconnected, and there's a theory that birds may have two separate consciousnesses happening at the same time. Super interesting.
Very interesting. So, and what kind of hardware you used, right? So one is the screen, right? Screen projector. Right?
Yeah, hardware. Right. So in the piece, I've developed the video puppetry system a bit for this piece. I'm now using a dedicated Linux box that I put together, and now the piece is all in C++ for the analysis part. And then I'm sending OSC to a second computer that is running Max and doing a bunch of synthesis there. But then from Max, I'm sending out audio CV to a Eurorack system, where I'm doing like a modular synthesis, and then back into the computer and to the speakers.
Yes, right. So it's, did you program on your own something as well for the piece? And what parts you?
The programming?
Yes.
I programmed everything. What do you mean? Pretty much, yeah. I've been working on, so in the previous pieces in Apophany and Scenes from the Plastosphere, I mean, I have my own set of synthesis objects that I coded a long time ago for like granular synthesis, and so this thing GranuBuff is an object that I made that I use a lot. And then most of it is self-coded, and then in those pieces I had made a jitter external for doing contour analysis, because it wasn't in the CVJIT library. I think they might have added it recently, but there's a lot of things that are in the more modern OpenCV library that aren't in the CVJIT, and also working in C++ is a little bit easier to sometimes for me to process things rather than using jitter sometimes. So eventually, for this, I've slowly been developing this C++ application that's just using OpenGL and OpenCV, and trying to really optimize the system for these pieces. Since I've been using the same software for a while, so now I'm just trying to make an appliance, do a hardware thing where it's just like the box that just does this stuff.
Got it. And can you imagine it's the same piece and would be performed without video puppetry?
No. Well, okay, maybe. Actually, yeah, it could. It could because and I shouldn't say it in a sad way, because I think that musically, actually, I've always thought about, when I'm composing, I always have a very physical, multimodal perspective. So whenever I'm composing, it's always been a kind of dance in a way.
Yes.
It's always this sense of gravity and so in rehearsal, I remember like just a couple days ago, I was sitting, the screen had come down already and they were just running through some different parts of the piece, and I thought, oh, well, it actually does work without the video puppetry. And that's, I think, part of what makes the video puppetry work, actually, is that the sound works.
Yes.
Because additionally, I mean, the puppetry is not representational to the degree that, like, someone who, I'm not a trained puppeteer, and someone who like a real like a piece that was really thought of from the puppetry perspective, I think would have much more coherence to the movement, right? Like some of my puppetry, just like, I'm still figuring it out. Like it's not as good as it could be. But because the music the gestures are in the music, the action of the puppetry attains some of this articulation from the sound. And so the sounds then help to change our perception of what we're seeing and add additional movement to it. So I think that it's written for performance in this way, but just like, Rite of Spring or, Petrushka work perfectly fine without the dance. I think these pieces also could be done as a kind of concert version, or I don't know. But I think
already with this piece, can you imagine this piece would work in radio as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think so, actually. Yeah.
And how was the process of working with performers, and did this process something change a piece or?
Oh yeah, but that's written in. I mean, part of the approach to I think most of my music is this interaction and the collaboration with the performers, because what I try to do is create a scenario that the performers take on themselves. So I create a situation with the performers, and the performers then are the ones that really are making the micro articulations, and because they are on stage with the audience, and so there's this participatory aspect to it where the audience is really part of the experience as well. And I hope that the pieces are flexible enough so that the performers can be feeling what's happening in the room and to adjust what they're doing to yeah, whatever that is of, you know, the performance. When, I mean, I used to play in bands with, where like the audience would be dancing like in kind of like psychedelic bands back in the 90s. And there's a really strong communication with the audience in those situations, because you can actually watch people dancing. And if you're improvising and you change, so I'm a guitar player, if you change your articulation, you can actually see the results in people's movements in the audience. And so I try to continue that perspective in the ensemble pieces, even though it's a different situation. It's, you know, serious music or whatever, but I still think of it in a way similar to these kind of participatory situations.
Maybe what was, let's say, three key learnings, right, for you?
The key learnings?
Yes, through that piece, right? So composing, creating, working with performers, and now performing it, right?
Yeah, oh, I learned a lot. But what exactly did I learn? I learned a lot, definitely. Well, since I jumped in to perform the piece at the last minute, I don't know if we were talking about before that one of the puppeteers wasn't able to perform because she tested positive just as we were starting the rehearsals, and she has a really great sense of working with the material. So I was very sad that she couldn't do it, but so I jumped in to do it. And because I also have performed scenes from a plastisphere a few times, but it was difficult to direct the ensemble also at the same time. So since I was on stage performing, I couldn't go sit in the hall and listen to the ensemble. And because everything is close mic'd, it's really hard to hear on stage what it really sounds like. And luckily, Arna, the sound engineer for Ensemble Mosaic, he's just fantastic. And so, I mean, I totally trust the whole ensemble. These are people I really trust entirely as artists. And so I knew that it was going to work. It was going to sound good, but I couldn't direct it in the way that I usually would. So, and I was doing everything myself. So I think I finally may have learned that I need a bigger team of people to work with. I've often, always done everything myself. Like I was mentioning, I programmed all my own stuff. I'm a real DIY person, because I think it's all part of the creative process, and it's like a sculpture that the more materials that you make yourself, the more, each step has a kind of imprint. But on the other hand, with a large scale piece, you just need more people. So that was something I learned. I learned that it's a lot easier I'm still learning about it, but in this experiment of having the musicians and the video interact with each other, so the puppeteers are listening to the ensemble and adjusting what they're doing based on that, plus the computer vision stuff and sound. And the ensemble is watching the puppetry on the screen and adjusting what they're doing based on that movement. So there's a feedback loop there. But what I think is that there's a difference in our reaction times going from visual to mechanical movement versus sound to mechanical movement. So for the puppeteers, the sound could lead them to change their behavior. And I think that it's harder, I think it's easier to go from sound to movement than from visual stimulus, especially with this complex scene, visual stimulus to performing with instruments. Now, I think part of it has to do kind of with what I was talking about before, about how if I was working with more articulated puppetry, it could be that there would be more of a line that you could follow visually, because the sounds have a much more linear kind of structure to them. So for the puppeteers, it's much easier to hear that, okay, there's a crescendo, and then there's this action that happens, and then that leads somewhere else, and it's much easier for, also they're all musicians, so that's also the other thing, is that the puppeteers are musicians as well, so they are very attuned to listening. And I just found it, in order to create a sense of connection between movement and sound, it was much easier for the puppeteers to follow the sound than vice versa. Whereas in scenes from a plastosphere and apopheny, because of the computer vision algorithm, I was able to go very closely following from visual to sound. That was, I feel like there's still a lot of space in this area to think about.
It's the last question, Rama. And the last question is, just imagine this will be, this our interview will be watched by new composers or by some other composers who would like to, let's say, explore or to create some their works using video puppetry. What would be your suggestions, right?
Try it. Just go for it. Yeah, one of my friends after the performance the other night was like, "How did you like?" He's like, I forget what he said. He was something like, "It's like, I love that you just like." You're like, yeah, and we're gonna have like this big spider thing just come out at the end and like do the, you know, it's like, yeah, I just gotta like, even if the idea sounds crazy, if it's in your mind, it's like, it's probably worth doing it. As long as it's not hurting anybody. And yeah, I think it's really important to I mean, it is this DIY thing, but I think as a composer, it's really helpful to have a direct experience of the materials. When I was an undergraduate, I went to a really small school in Vermont, and I was of one of two music theory and composition students. And pretty much everybody else in the department, in the music department, were pedagogy students, so becoming teachers. And so they threw us in with some of those classes that they had. And one of the great classes that I had to take as an undergraduate was for teachers who were going into high schools, where they have to learn how to play every instrument a little bit. So we had these classes where we would have like 1 week on the trombone, and then the next week was the oboe, and then the next week was the clarinet, and we would take home the instrument and we'd have to learn how to play it a little bit. We'd come in and play some, you know, silly songs as a terrible sounding ensemble. But having that physical experience really, I think, helps with writing music, because if you have an experience of what it is that you're writing for, the physical properties of it, you're going to write more connected to the physicality of that instrument. And I think video puppetry, or any kind of physical action, is the same thing, that the more you are engaged with the weight, the physical weight, or the texture, the image, everything about these objects that you're using, the more time you have to work with them in, even best would be in the site-specific place where the performance is going to happen, the better you can integrate things, if that's what if integration is the goal, or contrast or whatever. But I think that's would be, if people were wanting to work with objects, I would say that's what I would recommend, is get the objects and play around with them for a while. But don't forget to leave time to compose as well, because that's something that happens a lot with, especially like digital instruments. A lot of time goes into designing the system, and sometimes not enough time is left to actually do something artistic with it. So a lot of these like media lab places end up having kind of weak aesthetically musical output, because all of the research time that goes into the creation of the system, not the use of it.
Thank you very much, Rama. It was very exciting.